So Chad is the division chief for the Oregon State Police and Fire Marshal's Bureau. He has over 20 years of experience managing all hazard incidents, including as an incident commander for mass casualty incidents, wildfires, earthquakes, floods, even the COVID-19 pandemic. He has served in incident command at the state and local level. He has responded to major crude oil hazmat incidents within his state. I've had the opportunity to work as Chad as an instructor in delivering FEMA certified courses on crisis leadership and decision making and hazmat planning. And he has even conducted training there in Dubai and throughout the US. So with that, Chad, I'd like to get you started. If you would turn on your, make sure your camera is turned on and your microphone is turned on, and you can get started on your presentation.
Great, thank you, Bob. Let me get set up here. So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon where you are at. My name is Chad Hawkins, as Bob said. I am the division chief with the Fire Marshal Bureau at the State Police here in Oregon in the United States. I'm also an instructor for several different folks around the U.S., and Bob and I have done some work both in the United States and there in Dubai, having taught some hazardous materials courses. So you heard some of my background. I just put a couple pictures up here as far as some of the training components we've been a part of. I'm an NFPA 472 technical committee member. NFPA 472 is basically the National Fire Protection Association, Hazmat, Weapons of Mass Destruction, competency development group. So that's a lot of where training standards, both nationally and internationally, come from in the hazardous materials, first responder community, both from the awareness level all the way up to the technician and the specialist level as well. So the approach that I'm going to take to this training today to deliver you folks is both a high-level incident command perspective, and then seeing how you can be successful in the incident command arena with having some of those components in place, such as pre-planning, as Bob alluded to, and also some of those training competencies as well as we go through kind of the methodology. We are only as successful as we were prior to the incident occurring, meaning if we had pre-plans in place, if we had some response options, some hazmat training capabilities, we'd be able to go ahead and be more successful once we go to that incident, and then doing a post-incident analysis or an after-action report would probably show that we were successful due to some of these factors. And I'm going to show a case study today where you might be able to take a nugget or two away of how we were successful on one of our most recent hazardous materials incidents. So when we talk about major incident planning and response, you have to truly take that all hazards approach. So we're really going to take it from a perspective of, is it civil unrest? Is it a large scale fire, commercial or wildland? Is it a natural disaster, a flood, earthquake, things along those lines? COVID-19 and the worldwide pandemic we have seen has really challenged and impacted our systems and infrastructure. And really, when you talk about first responders and our hospital communities, it's really affected how we do operations on a day-to-day basis. All in all, when you take that whole all hazards approach, that all hazards planning approach, you're looking at it from the beginning to the end, how to prevent, protect, plan for, respond to, and recover. So when you go through that methodology, you really look at all the systems that could help you be successful to favorably change the outcome, which is the goal of all the incident responses that we're a part of, private or public agencies. Our goal is to ultimately send folks home safe at the end of the day and keep the public safe when we're responding out into those hazardous environments. One thing when you look at the all hazards approach as well is all of the incidents listed in the all hazards model, you're going to see that wildfires, commercial fires, natural disasters, civil unrest, fire, floods of any type, they all have a hazardous materials component. So when you talk about the highest level of threat to first responders, it's typically the more complex or unknown type incidents, and hazardous materials incidents truly do pose to first responders some of the biggest or most critical risks as it relates to life safety. So what do we see out there? It could be unknown, substances on the side of a roadway or in urban or commercial areas, industrial areas. Maybe it's a transportation emergency of some sort. Maybe it's our cell phone towers or some of our server farms we're seeing that are being built across the United States and abroad. You see that there's a lot of transportation by rail when you look at some of the hazardous materials transported across the world. You'll see that by rail is in some circumstances 30 to 40% of the transportation method utilized to get those hazardous materials to their in-destination facilities. So when you look at some of those components, hazardous materials truly is complex and looks at a diverse hazard group. It can be both localized, it can be traveling, and it can be in large quantities. You could have storage facilities, like we said, the rail transportation, and then obviously bulk farms or tank farms where they store large amounts of typically hazardous materials, flammable products most likely. So how do we get to an incident? What is our process? So when we respond to an incident as first responders, again, we're only as good as we have been trained, as we have been educated on the hazardous materials arena and what our equipment and our pre-planning has allowed us to do. But when we get there at the beginning, there's going to be an emergency call placed. There's going to be a problem, an incident, a situation, an event, an episode. Something is going to happen. And then you get to that unscheduled release when we talk about hazardous materials. That's when we're going to go ahead and evaluate, okay, now we're responding, we have what we have. Bob said, you only know what you know. And at this point, we have to respond based on the training, experience, education, equipment, plans in place that moment when that emergency call is placed. We have threats to life, property, and environment. One of the components that may get lost in translation sometimes is that when firefighters, first responders, or any members of private or public service that are involved in a hazardous materials incident, that life component, we need to make sure that we're safe doing our job. We can only make the public safe once we know that we're doing our job safe. We have the equipment to do it successfully and mitigate the scene that we're on. Ultimately, though, you go back to that beginning state. You don't have the ability to plan anymore once that emergency has occurred. So you get to that crisis phase. So you have the release, you show up, you evaluate, you're going through your methodology in response to the incident itself, prioritizing different items, and then you get to that crisis phase where that scene is unstable still. It's really expanding. You may have different facets of the response taking place. And again, at this point, this is where we become successful or we don't. We can go right or left on the road, if you will. Right being it's still a bad incident, but at the end of the day, we mitigated it. We had the equipment, we had the training, we had the pre-planning in place to be successful. However, if we don't have those systems in place, we don't have that training, we don't have that equipment, understanding, process, methodology, all of those different things, we could get to a disaster state where that crisis will transition to a disaster. And in this picture, this is West Texas from the United States in the state of Texas. And they had multiple first responder casualties due to some lack, amongst other things, of some planning, some response considerations, understanding of the product and just the general hazardous materials itself. You heard earlier that, looking at the Beirut explosion and the ammonium nitrate concerns that are out there, same concerns here prevalent in the United States. This incident was indeed fertilizer grade ammonium nitrate as well. So these are international problems. They are not specific to one region. We have to address them appropriately, and we can typically do that at the early stages with education, training, and then we go into the pre-planning components of it. So the case study I'm going to give you is where I was a part of an incident, part of the incident command team here in Oregon on the west coast of the United States. It's involving a Bakken crude oil train. Now, if you're familiar with Bakken crude oil is a very light crude oil. It ignites and has some of the same flammability components as gasoline, burns with a little more intensity, more BTUs or British thermal units. And generally, there's been an uptick in this type of commodity being transported over the United States over here. So we're seeing it in large numbers. They typically transport a lot of products. So each tank car can range from 28,000 to 32,000 gallons of product. And they're usually in an arrangement of approximately anywhere from 90 to 120 of those railroad tank cars all in a row. When you look at some of the considerations to this hazmat response was absolutely a success. Why was it a success? Well, because they had done some pre-planning, they had done some education, they had done some training to focus on this particular commodity, this hazardous material in Bakken crude oil. We've really focused on a lot of those components over the years to see what you have in your area and train on that accordingly. So the fire department in the area had really stepped up to take some training courses. They had done a exercise and a couple other things that we'll talk about a little bit later. But for the most part, very successful incident. And you can see that there was a lot of values at risk in critical infrastructure here. You have a major waterway, you have a major thoroughfare as far as the interstate that's located right there, the road, and then you also have a small community of folks. And so there was multiple facets to this incident. There was the firefighting effort, there was the containment of the product so it didn't spread, and then there was also the evacuation of the community. I have a couple videos that I'm going to go ahead and show you now. So at this point, this fire ended up burning for about 12 to 14 hours. We had 16 tank cars derail, which each one of them contained approximately 28,000 gallons of product. We ended up having about 50 to 60,000 gallons of product on fire on the ground in a large pool fire. And so when you talk about objectives, strategy, and tactics, you had to look at multiple facets of this incident. It posed some different issues. Again, hazardous materials is not a one-size-fits-all response that the first responder community is used to, whether it's vehicle accidents, structure fires, commercial structure fires, wildland incidents. Those types of incidents, while posing risk to life, property, environment, they don't have, I would say, as many complexities or as many factors to take into account when you deal with one of these incidents. So another big piece to the success of this incident is utilizing technology. Now, this incident occurred about 4 years ago in 2016. So it's very recent, and this was very early on when technology, especially related to drones, was coming available and coming online to be utilized in the first responder community. And you can really see the benefit when you talk about the hazardous materials community component of this. Our job, going back to one of my initial slides, is life, property, environment, right? When you categorize that and you create that hierarchy, putting someone in a hazardous material suit of any level and sending them down range is going to increase risk inherently. However, if you had a drone, go ahead and utilize the drone to do your scene size up, and if able, you could have some monitoring capabilities or aspects to it. So this is some of the drone video from the incident. As you can see from the drone video, very excellent tool to have in our toolbox to utilize as a response resource. It gives us the ability to look at the incident from a 360-degree perspective. It allows us to see any exposures, any concerns, any hazards, how we could better evaluate the incident or focus assets or resources to the incident. And again, at the end of the day, we're not necessarily having folks go in suits or structural firefighting ensembles down into that hazardous environment. We can keep everyone out, evaluate from afar, and then go ahead and make some of our strategy and tactical decisions based on what we see from the drone video. So one of the things with hazmat incidents as well, and you folks are probably very versed in this, is the hazardous materials incident itself may not just be the product on the ground, especially in this case, you can see it being on fire. That column of smoke contains many different products of combustion, aldehydes, and also all other sorts of carcinogens. So we also have to take into account where that plume is going, what direction it's going, the community to be impacted potentially, and if we need to have some notifications go out to that community to either evacuate or shelter in place. So again, drone technology, very useful in the hazmat arena. So looking at some of the post-incident analysis and after-action report components of this incident was that every aspect from, again, the beginning to end with some challenges in between were met, and no one from the beginning to the incident to the end of the incident was hurt. This incident took about 7 days from the time of it started all the way to the fire being extinguished, and then the remediation and the recovery efforts associated with the cleanup operation. So from the initial first responding police and law enforcement entities utilizing their emergency response guidebook, to those firefighters receiving that specialized training, to our hazardous materials team showing up and being able to do some community monitoring to confirm that the levels of benzene, for example, were below appropriate thresholds. So once we reintroduce folks to their back into their homes, because we had evacuated them, that we felt comfortable doing so. The big thing, I guess the big couple things that rose to the top as far as successes with this incident was that a full-scale exercise took place about a month prior to this incident actually occurring. So they had actually identified crude oil being transported in this region as a threat, identified what is the worst case scenario. If this were to happen in our community, how would we respond? And they looked at it from a kind of global perspective. They looked at it from both the first responder community, the emergency management aspect of it, the firefighter training equipment, hazardous materials team response, how they engage some of the departments that may have a role to play in this incident, whether it's environmental quality, air quality, forestry, law enforcement. They looked at all of those components in that full-scale exercise to truly see where their gaps were. Once they had that exercise, they did a gap analysis, right? They identified a bunch of components where they didn't have a plan in place. They didn't have appropriate piece of equipment or a water source. And so they mitigated those gaps, and lo and behold, a month later, this occurred. So when you look at what kind of incidents you should plan for, you have to really take that approach of plan for those incidents that you may not expect, that are just plausible, that are just out there. There's only been 27 derailments involving Bakken crude oil in North America. This was number 28. So the likelihood isn't very high, but the complexity associated with a derailment of this type is very vast, very wide, and it's going to overwhelm any system that this takes place in. So again, practice, train, exercise on those worst case scenarios. And then the other components that you see there at the bottom, which are implementing the incident command system early and developing a solid organizational structure so that the incident is run smoothly. It has all of those command and control components in place to be successful. And then they slowly started developing an IAP, or an incident action plan, which basically memorializes all of the information that's going on in the incident, everything from a safety message to resource unit allocations, so on and so forth, as that incident became an extended attack incident. Really documents and puts things in chronological order to help folks be successful. Hazmat planning and management, hazmat response planning and management has multiple facets, and there's very broad spectrum when looking at how you can be successful. Like we talked about at the very beginning of this, it starts with that pre-planning component, identifying you have a hazardous material being transported, stored, or developed within your community, creating that plan appropriately and bringing in the appropriate stakeholders. So again, when we show up at scene on that very bad day, we're all going to have an understanding of what our roles are, our responsibilities are, and how we can be successful. So you have pre-planning, utilization of the incident command system. So we have the understanding of who's in charge, who I report to, and what the roles and responsibilities of each one of those functions are going to be. What decision support or decision-making tools do you have available to you? What sort of equipment do you have available to you? How you can, utilize equipment from adjoining jurisdictions, both private and public entities. And then ultimately, one of those big foundational components is having the first responders trained and having exercises to test those levels of training appropriately. We can have good pre-plans, but without that first responder aspect to build into the pre-planning component, we might not be as successful. First responder training in the utmost, it is of the utmost importance to have a successful incident. Hazmat incidents pose very complex, situations, and they tax the hazardous materials and public safety arena when we talk about responders, because they're complex. What we've seen from a lot of after actions and things around the United States is folks may not have a thorough understanding of hazardous materials response, what the appropriate levels of PPE to utilize are, and ultimately maybe not even having the equipment to address those specific hazardous materials needs. If we get our responders trained up to appropriate levels and really bring up those levels of competency, we're going to be better successful as I would say command or planning entities, because we're going to be able to rely on those hazmat modules, those training components, those expertise, equipment, material they have to be successful on those incidents, and it'll reduce accidents, injuries, illnesses. It could have a economic impact, especially if you have high-level hazardous materials technicians, specialists, so on and so forth. If they know processes and they know methodology to be successful, it might mitigate continual release. They might be able to stop that leak earlier or notify the public earlier, and so that you're reducing your casualties or reducing your exposures to whatever hazardous materials that could be released. So ultimately, it's a twofold successful operation if we can get our folks trained to the appropriate levels. Looking at competencies for hazmat first responders are going to be found where, in the United States and internationally in the National Fire Protection Association NFPA 472 guidance. It basically is the guidance document that develops the competence for responders to hazmat, weapons of mass destruction incidents, and develops minimum levels and minimum training standards associated with hazardous materials response. Having something as a baseline or a foundational document or a foundational training component, again, sets the level of expectation that you can have when you're developing your pre-planning components. What is the local response community able to provide when they arrive at that hazmat facility? What is the procedure? What's the process? Who's going to be in charge? Something as simple as determining which agency is going to be lead, rather than wait for that incident to occur and try to figure it out in that crisis stage to where it could end up becoming transitioning from a crisis to a disaster. So utilizing NFPA 472 framework is an excellent tool to be successful. It increases the first responder competencies, reduces accidents, injuries, and fatalities. Some examples of some really solid training that I recommend and should be utilized for first responders around the world, from the awareness level all the way up to the technician and specialist level. I've listed a couple there, are crisis leadership and decision-making for hazardous materials. Any level of incident command system training. There's various levels based on your rank and your officer standing. Hazmat emergency response pre-planning courses and delivery systems on how to make a good emergency response plan related to hazardous materials facilities. And then obviously you have the hazmat specific components within 472: awareness, operations, decontamination, technician, specialist, safety officer, and incident commander. And I strongly encourage all officers that may be in command or in charge of a hazardous materials scene to really look at being certified as a hazardous materials incident commander, along with that crisis leadership and decision-making course, because those are things where they really look at putting you in some complex situations and making you develop decisions and objectives, strategies, and tactics as it relates to some of these hazardous materials incidents. That is the end of my presentation. I appreciate the opportunity and I'm honored to be a part of it today. And Bob, turn it back over to you.